I went back to work for another year, but during that whole year, I spent most of the time just looking at maps and thinking, well, what kind of big trip can I do? And I thought about flying to Australia or New Zealand. And I thought, well, I'm in Japan and I have another year of teaching on my contract, and I don't actually need to fly anywhere. I can begin from Japan. And it just seemed like a sort of logical thing that coming from the UK, I would make the UK my final destination. And so, yeah, I jumped from doing a 3-week trip to what ended up being almost a 3-year trip, setting off in 2005, a year later.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Peter Gostelow. It was 2001 when Peter first had the seeds of curiosity planted in his mind as to what it would be like to travel slowly and discover new places on a bicycle. Then in 2004, he set off on his first cycle tour, 2,000 kilometres around the island of Kyushu in Japan. Since that first trip, Peter has gone on some monumental tours. In 2005, he set off from Japan to cycle back home, that being the UK. He would arrive 3 years later after amassing a monumental 48,800 kilometres along the way. From England, he would leave once more, this time to head south. Another 3 years spent immersed in slow travel, 34,500 kilometres pedalling to South Africa. He has continued touring extensively since, spent years cycling through the African continent, the Middle East, as well as Europe. An adventure CV like this feels so big, an introduction to someone who has spent so many years cycling in over 85 countries and 145,000 kilometres, a lifestyle led in the true spirit of slow travel. To say I'm excited is an understatement. I can't wait to explore Peter's story more and have him share the stories and experiences of a life pedalling the road less travelled. Peter, a very heartfelt, warm welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And that was quite an introduction. I'm not sure how to follow up from that. But yeah, well researched, pretty spot on as well. So that's great. Thank you.
I'm really excited for this, Peter. I feel that you are going to be telling us so many tales and stories here. Sharing your experiences is going to transport myself and the listeners of the show to so many places that you've travelled down the road on your bike. But before we get into the details of all of that, a question which I like to start the show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
I do. Well, I specifically remember learning to ride a bike without the stabilizers. I think I was probably, I'd have to ask my mum, because I remember she was pushing supporting the bicycle because the stabilizers had come off. I lived in Edinburgh in Scotland when I was very young. I must have been perhaps 4 or 5 years old. And I just remember the moment of my mum letting go and then me cycling without stabilizers and feeling that sense of freedom that I was just alone on the bike and riding down this residential road. And I was scared of turning a corner because I thought if I turn a corner, I'll come off. So I kept on going straight and then just hit the brakes and looked around. And I think 100 meters behind me, yeah, my mum must have been there. So that's my first memory. I don't specifically remember what bicycle it was, and she probably wouldn't remember either. But I do remember the first moment of riding without some kind of support on the bike. That's a very early memory, actually, a long, long time ago.
To think of the way that you've travelled on a bike since, I sort of hinted there that you had the idea planted in your head to start on these trips. But before we do that, something that you said about that first memory is something that has been repeated by previous guests as well. And it's one word, and it's freedom. And it's that feeling of freedom, especially when the training wheels are off. It's that freedom to just go to places. And I feel like you've rediscovered that and embedded that in the way that you've travelled here. Can I ask, the idea to travel on a bicycle, Because it would be wrong to assume that the only travel you've ever done as an adult is on a bicycle, because you've actually done some good bits of travel without the bike beforehand as well. So how did you decide that you wanted to change things up and go a bit slower?
Well, I think in my early 20s, when I'd finished university and I was effectively backpacking, I was traveling in Africa as well as Turkey and the Caucasus. And the concept of riding a bicycle, perhaps more than a few hours and crossing countries, just seemed impossible. But I'd met a few cyclists on those journeys, and it was a time when I was getting a bit tired and frustrated with, I guess, the monotony of long bus journeys. Specifically, it was in Turkey. And I remember meeting a cyclist there who told me stories of staying with local families and camping out on the roadside. And it just sounded a lot more adventurous than sort of standard travel backpacking. So that was the initial kind of seed. I mean, I'd always grown up with bicycles. As a teenager, I had bikes and I lived in the countryside. So I was familiar with riding bikes, but never, more than sort of 20, 30 kilometers from where I grew up. But yeah, those first seeds were planted on the basis of having done some travel before and then thinking, well, yeah, if other people can do it, why can't I? I know enough about a bicycle and I enjoy cycling. So I think I was probably 22, 23 when, I started reading accounts of other people who'd done long bike journeys. And I remember specifically coming across the name of a German cyclist who most bike travelers may have heard of. He spent most of his life on the road, Heinz Stuck. So his story was definitely instrumental in the beginning. And then I read some books by, the likes of Devla Murphy and Josie Jew, so authors who'd traveled by bike. And it was going out to Japan a year or so later to live and teach English that I thought, well, during my free time and my weekends or holidays, I want to experience this kind of travel.
Was it the idea melded with what you'd visually seen to what you had been immersing yourself with, that literature of tales, to see, I wonder how this would go for me? Like when you set out, and that first trip, by the way, 2,000 kilometres for a first cycle tour is nothing to be sneezed at either. But did you ever have an idea that it was going to get as big for you as it's become?
Not really, no. I mean, that first trip, which was almost 20 years ago, that concept of freedom was a big aspect or a big thing. The simplicity of getting on the bike and riding to new places, not knowing exactly where or how far I would go each day, because I very much love just the spirit of freedom and camping out and seeing how far I get. That all happened in that first trip, which was about 3 weeks around the island of Kyushu. So there were a combination of things. It was a sense of freedom and simplicity and the exhilaration and joy of seeing new places and the challenge and the exercise. It all came together, really. And I also knew by this point that I was very comfortable in my own company. I didn't really know this actually until I traveled around Africa after university, that because I went out there thinking, I can't do this by myself. I need to be with someone else. I mean, that trip itself, which had nothing to do with cycling, I went out for 2 months and ended up staying for 8 months. And I'd realized that, I was happy in my own company. So that, which can be an aspect or an issue for people who are solo traveling on a bicycle, never really was when I took that first trip around Japan. But when I'd finished that trip, all I could really think about was doing something much bigger. I went back to work for another year, but during that whole year, I spent most of the time just looking at maps and thinking, well, what kind of big trip can I do? And I thought about flying to Australia or New Zealand. And I thought, well, I'm in Japan and I have another year of teaching on my contract, and I don't actually need to fly anywhere. I can begin from Japan. And it just seemed like a sort of logical thing that coming from the UK, I would make the UK my final destination. And so, I jumped from doing a 3-week trip to what ended up being almost a 3-year trip, setting off in 2005, a year later.
What a trip. And can I just say, I love that you used the word logical. Such a logical thing to do, to go from Japan all the way to the UK.
Yeah.
And can I say, this is the time before the algorithm. Like, I know you were reading the books and you were looking at the maps, but it's not like Instagram existed or YouTube. YouTube didn't exist then either.
No.
It's not like you were suggested posts and seen stories. Like, to even the way to learn about countries was so vastly different then as well.
Yeah, it was a very, very, I say, yeah, a very different time. It was different in the sense that, yeah, there was no, I didn't have a phone for that entire trip. So I relied entirely on paper maps. And most countries I went through, I had a guidebook, a Lonely Planet. And in some countries like China and India, the Lonely Planet was over 1,000 pages. So you just used to rip out the relevant chapters. It was a time when most towns and cities would have an internet cafe and you would cycle there and then pick up your email and perhaps the people that you met, you could find out where they were staying. So it was entirely different. And another very different aspect about traveling then is I really think I spoke to a lot more people, you see, in terms of asking for directions or places to stay and places to eat. I mean, these days, everybody just uses their phone for, research and getting the answers. And it's made travel very different. It's made it a lot more convenient. But back then, specifically with mapping, if you imagine cycling into cities like Beijing and Bangkok and without actually any paper map, it's entirely different to now where you have your little bike computer or your phone, which is telling you when to turn left or right. So I remember a lot of times stopping and asking people and many times not actually understanding what people were saying, but usually, even if it's in a different language, you get a sense of you're going in the right way or you're going the wrong way. So none of that really exists anymore. And I feel like most people probably do when they travel that if they don't have their phone or it breaks, you're completely lost because there are no internet cafes now and everybody effectively has a phone. So it's just technology has changed in such a way that it's made travel quite different now.
I mean, you're speaking about things that I'm having memories of. I remember distinctly when you were talking about internet cafes. I lived in the UK in 2007, 2008. And I remember, that was where you have to go when you first move there, when you're looking for work, everyone's there and you're looking for all those sorts of things. But I also remember distinctly from my time there, that was when GPS for like cars first came sort of out as well. One of my old bosses, he went on motorcycle tours through Europe and extensive ones, pretty cool, just with a motor. Ewan McGregor type style and Charlie Borman type trips.
Yeah.
But, and he was telling me about this device, this GPS. And I remember saying to him, oh, that'd never catch on in Australia. We wouldn't need to use that. And I look at that now. I swear every time, sometimes I'll open my phone just to see where I'm going in my own city. And I'm like, remember when GPS wasn't going to take off? But it's such a different spirit of travel. And even just having a phone, smartphones these days, they're not just phones, are they? They're a device that can make a phone call or receive a text message. But, I imagine when you're on the road for mapping, for finding accommodation, for things like translating as well, when you need to try and get a message across, they're almost like a survival guide. Is there part of you that ever actually misses the simplicity of what it used to be like?
Yeah, at times. In recent months or years, there are occasions where I'm camping and there's absolutely no network. And I'm like, well, that's great. My phone just switches off. And so recently I was in Cyprus, in northern Cyprus. I didn't have any network. I was only there for just over a week, but every evening my phone was off and I was reading on my Kindle. And reading is something that I do far less of in terms of books. When I go back to my earlier journeys, I was carrying paperbacks and I was reading in my tent and reading in hostels or wherever I stayed. So not having the phone means that, I spend more time reading, which is definitely a positive thing. And absolutely, I think, to travel without a phone, I wouldn't choose to do it now. But the times when I don't have access to my phone or the internet, it can be quite refreshing. Yeah.
Hello, listeners. It's Bella here, host of the show. Now, one of the things I love about podcasting is knowing that when I press record, while the session may just be me and my guests, I know that that conversation is really being heard by many thousands of people all around the world. With every episode I release, I always consider you to be an integral part of each interview I conduct and the show that I produce. From conducting my research to asking those interview questions to editing and releasing each episode, all of this done with you, the listener, in my mind. It's because of this that I really value being able to hear directly from you so that I can continue to enhance your podcast listening experience. What I am seeking from you now is your input into a survey that I have put together. And I appreciate the time you're taking to just go to that survey. I've linked it in the show notes and have you share your thoughts with me here. It's just a few short questions to just see what you value about the show, what you look forward to the most, and also maybe how you see the future of the show as well. Once again, thank you for being an integral part of the Seek Travel Ride community. Now, let's get back to the show. And I guess there's some things that probably you never lose the passion for. You were talking about spending a lot of time looking at maps and thinking about things and getting excited for it. Is that something you still do now? Like, do you pull out a map and go, I wonder, or...
I still have lots of paper maps that I use specifically in Africa. I don't really pull them out because they're all sort of buried in a drawer. But whenever I see, if I walk into a room and there's a map of a country or a map of an area, specifically if it's a good terrain map, I love looking at it, actually. I mean, recently, yes, I was in the Caucasus and it was quite difficult to like route plan in Georgia and in Armenia. You know, when you're looking at a phone and you're looking at whatever it is, Google Maps or Komoot, you know, you're zooming in and zooming out and you don't really get a real feel of being able to plan a route quite so easily as you would do with looking at a paper map. And I always used to carry paper maps of countries, and I used to every evening get the map out and see where I'd cycled from and where I was going to. And I love that. But, you know, those paper maps that I traveled had almost no detail in comparison to what exists now on, you know, these apps or satellite apps. I wouldn't change that. But yeah, in terms of route planning, which I'm not particularly, I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at in the sense of pre-planning like weeks and months ahead. You know, I have an idea of the direction I'm going, and then I will look at the roads that are possible to take. But sometimes, depending on the country you're in, you know, you have issues which might be there are no roads going through the mountains, or you know, for example, in Georgia there are occupied territories and roads are closed, so that makes it a lot more challenging. But in general, yeah, I do miss that sort of love of just, you know, being able to open a map out in my tent or in the morning and see where the simplicity of just seeing where I'm going as opposed to staring down at a screen and doing it.
There'd be other things too I was just thinking about there, you know, because there's two sides there. There's one, looking at a map to plan where you're going to go. There's a practical side of things, but then there's also the nostalgia that comes from looking back at a map and thinking. And it just struck me, Peter, that, you know, when you're reading a book or you're watching a film or a TV show and it starts talking about or showing you a scene of a place that you've been to, there must be a word to describe that feeling. But for some reason, it sparks this sort of feeling of, oh, I've been there, and this, you know, reminiscing. And it sort of struck me that you must have those moments, or you have the ability to have those moments quite often with where you've been and what you've done. And whether it's someone mentioning a village or a town or seeing a country featured in the news or something like that, there would be things that would spark that so often.
Well, yeah, I was with somebody a few days ago and describing a trip in South Africa and where I'd gone. I mean, it's slightly different from what you're talking about, but we looked at the map and I realized I'd cycled right by her house where she grew up. And then I started looking at this map. It wasn't a paper map, but it was a Google map that I'd created. It was about 8 or 9 years ago. I hadn't looked at that map for a long time. So I think actually, yeah, having all these maps or routes that have been created digitally, looking at these collections that I make on Komoot, because I'm usually looking at either on my phone or a small screen. Even if it was a large digital screen, I don't think it would have the same feel as it would. Because actually, I remember, before sort of digitalization of maps, when I went through Africa, I was using all different kinds of maps, but the main regional maps were these Michelin maps, and you could actually join like the northwest part of Africa to the central part, to the southern part. So on my wall where I lived in Tanzania for a few years, I had this enormous map of Africa, which was pieced together by 3 maps. And on that, I basically drew the route that I took on my first big journey through Africa. And it was always great when people came round. I felt, I was kind of showing off, but people were always very curious to see this route that I'd taken through West and Central Africa. I drew this black line through the continent. And yeah, I did have a phone on that trip, but it wasn't a smartphone and I didn't have GPS. So I sometimes wish I had done, because there are lots of places now when I look back. I spent time cycling through Tibet and other parts of the world which are quite remote. And I couldn't tell you exactly now, like, where I camped and which roads I specifically cycled on. Because even though I kept a handwritten journal, I wasn't so detailed as to say exactly which roads I was on. Whereas now, in the last 10 years, most of the trips that I've done, they've all been recorded digitally. So I could easily pull out a map from, 2015 or something and show exactly which roads I took and where I camped and the little wiggles where I went, took the wrong turning.
There's always one of those little, it's like a T on the line, isn't it? It sort of darts out and you come back in and you go, oops, I wonder what happened there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that it wasn't a wrong turning, but it was a few days ago I'd looked at this map that I'd made of cycling in the Horn of Africa, and I was actually in South Sudan. And I was trying to cross into Ethiopia, where there is no legal border crossing, but a friend of mine who'd worked in that region had said that I would be able to do it. So I followed this remote track for about 2 days, and then I basically got picked up by the police. And it's not a long story, but I ended up being thrown out of the country, kind of politely. But when I look back on the map, there's this line which goes right out into the middle of nowhere, probably about 50 kilometers from an Ethiopian border. And then it just stops, because that's where I had to put my bike in the back of a pickup and be driven 200 kilometers back in the way I'd come. So yeah, that makes the map quite interesting, and it obviously triggers a very vivid memory of that time.
Absolutely. It's interesting, like you were talking about Komoot there, and it was previous guests of the show, Laura and Simon, who are currently cycling around the world at the moment. They taught me a new term that they'd come across, which was called being commuted, which is when you've plotted something out and Komoot tells you that you can go this way, and then all of a sudden it tells you to keep cycling through a river or keep cycling through a brick wall. And I imagine, I don't know if you've used Komoot in that manner before, but I can only imagine the types of route misadventures that you would have had on this trip.
Yeah, that's a nice word for it. I've been commuted many times. Some countries, it's quite obvious that commute doesn't work as well. So yeah, well, I could tell you many times when I've cycled along a track and then it's just basically disappeared. I mean, in Romania, I was following track up through a woodland, and this track was like a logging track, and the higher up I went, the fainter and fainter the track was. And I thought, really? Has anybody come this way? You see, it's using open source mapping. There would have been a track here, and there was a track, but obviously in that environment, without anybody using it for many, many years, it was completely overgrown. So I ended up trying to pull my bike up through this forest where there was no track anymore and follow this river course. But then it was raining, and I actually thought it was going to become quite dangerous. I mean, that's another big issue about bike travel in this context, is okay, the map is telling me to keep going, but clearly I'm going uphill and I'm not actually on a track. It's starting to get dark. It's starting to rain. Do I trust the map and keep going and hope that there'll be a track on the other side? Or do I turn around and call it quits and admit, not really defeat, but just that I'm going to have to go back the way I came? And I think, every situation is different. It's a call that you make. And if you're by yourself, you have to make that decision. If you're with somebody else, then you're going to ask them. I mean, earlier this year, I was cycling with a French guy in Turkey, and we'd seen this path going over a mountain. It still had snow on it, but we could see the switchbacks going up. So we thought, well, let's give it a try. And we got up to the snow, and he walked through the snow, and I watched him walking ahead up the sort of knee deep in the snow. And then I looked up and there was this dark cloud coming with more what happened to be rain. And I was just standing there absolutely freezing. And I just said to him, I'm going back. And so we turned back, and it was the right decision to make, because then it rained really, really heavily for the next hour. And if we'd carried on going up this pass, I would have, just absolutely frozen. So I think I've digressed from what we were saying, but basically, being commuted.
You've been commuted. Exactly.
I've been commuted many times. And so that's why, yeah, most bike travelers won't just use one singular map. Google Satellite can be useful, but then if you're in an area where there isn't very good reception, you're not going to have the detail on the satellite. No map is ever perfect. I mean, you can look on a satellite map and you could see a track, but you don't know if that track consists of deep sand or it's rocky. So it's basically a question of your level of adventure to take some of these smaller tracks, which your mapping app might, direct you on. And then that comes down to how much time you have on your trip and all the other conditions, whether it's like the weather, it could be how much food or water you're carrying. So all of these things play into your route planning. Of course, it's much simpler just to follow the main roads, but in lots of countries, the main roads have too much traffic or they're just not as enjoyable to go on than these smaller tracks.
And I have to say, when you talk about smaller tracks, and we've talked about your time in Africa, because you've spent a significant amount of your time in Africa, whether it was cycling there or even, when you were in Tanzania working there as well. But I must admit, Peter, I was looking through some of the images from your previous trips. There were a couple of things that really struck out in me. The first one was just how many amazing encounters you've had with locals in Africa using the bike to go about their daily business. And it strikes me when people go on long trips like you do, your bike's fully loaded, right? And it's not a light load, I wouldn't think. I'm sure you've probably really got that dialed in now and you're taking exactly what you need. But it's still like you look at it, and as someone who rides a bike, I look at it and go, power to you for hauling that. But then you come across these photos that you've taken in Africa of people like loaded bikes with almost like 2 stories of pineapples or lots of heavy bricks, or bicycle is really a tool for them to transport their work and their livelihood. That was something that struck me. But something that also then struck me was the roads in Africa. Wow, like the road less traveled, which is where the adventure does begin. My gosh, you've had some amazing, amazing tracks that you found yourself on there, because they're not dirt roads. They're not champagne dirt. Let's put it that way. You had some quite significant, interesting bike adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these tracks would be used by local people to walk on or to transport goods by bicycle, and often they're not riding the bicycle, especially if they're going uphill, because most of the bikes are single speed and they don't have gears. So the interaction in that context is always interesting. When I reflect back on it, it's very often that many people would be slightly amused and bemused, confused and surprised as to why European is choosing to struggle. Because it is a struggle, it's a challenge, and we ride bikes on these journeys for that challenge. We enjoy the reward, but it's all our choice, isn't it? We've left our Western lifestyle and somehow reveled in this struggle. When I'm pouring with sweat, cycling up or pushing up a steep hill, and I see this guy carrying hundreds of bricks or hundreds of logs, or a woman, it's like two worlds coming together from, very opposing sides, and their struggle is the same, but actually very different from mine, because they're doing it mostly out of necessity. There's no need for me to be taking these like really remote and sometimes very challenging and potentially dangerous routes, but I do it for some kind of fixation of adventure. And I enjoy the buzz that comes with it, but I'm also, I think as time goes on, much more reflective of asking myself, well, I've actually done this many, many times before. Am I getting something new and different out of that? And that's a conversation or topic which has perhaps been much more prevalent in my mind in the last year or two than it definitely was when I was younger. And I was really setting out to sort of challenge myself, because I've done this many, many times. I sort of asked myself, well, I know I can do it, because in the beginning, you're asking yourself, well, this is a challenge. Let's see if I can do it. Let's see if I can travel by myself for a long period of time. Let's see if I can get up this 4,000 or 5,000 meter pass. And once you've done it many, many times, you kind of know you can do it. And so you start asking yourself, well, am I still getting the same kind of benefit from it. And different days I have different feelings. I think it's a mixture of loving the challenge and the joy that comes through cycling. And that's always been the same. And I think it always will. But sometimes I'm more reflective of asking myself, and I usually ask these questions at times when I'm not actually on the road. It's usually like between trips and I'm thinking of going on another trip. And I'm asking myself, well, am I going to get the same reward from this as I did before? And I'm sure many other people reflect upon this, and not necessarily with cycling. It could be in everything that they're doing in life, whether it's, physical kind of adventure, or whether it's in actual fact sitting in an office or in somewhere and asking, well, I've been doing this many times before. What am I getting new from it? What am I learning that's new? Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent.
I love your tangents. No, honestly, I could listen to you go off on many, because I think what you say there, it's really resonating with me. Peter, I've not done massive tours to the extent that you've done, but I've certainly ridden a loaded bike up some very challenging terrain, and I know exactly what in the moment, there's times where I'm like, why am I doing this? I have the extra complexity if I hate going downhill. So to me, riding up the uphill, I don't get the pleasure of enjoying the downhill, because generally I'm sort of a bit scared. So it's like I have this unique thing where I would rather ride the uphill hard climb twice than have to go down it. But with each time, it's sort of trying to get over that. And I've been very open on this show about talking about that as well. For me, there's always the payoff for me often has to do with my driver. It's not necessarily getting to the summit, if it's a hill, or getting to the end part. It's sort of, I love being immersed in my landscape and being immersed in my surroundings. And I love being curious about what's going to be around the next corner. What's the view going to be like there? And I think that's my challenge. And I don't know, I've certainly picked up on, you mentioned a few times in posts how you don't like to plan your routes in a lot of detail. You don't necessarily have a set. You might have a very far distant end point, but how you get there, you can't say, well, by the end of this week, I'm going to have amassed this many kilometres and I will have gone to this village and this is the road I'm taking. You love a freestyle type of approach of being able to make those choices on the road.
Yeah.
Does curiosity play into that for you then? Or is it more a practicality of planning trips differently?
I think it's a combination of things. Most of my trips, not all of them, but many of them have been done with the luxury and freedom of time, which makes all the difference. Most people who are traveling are on a limited time frame, so it could be anything from a few weeks to months, or of course, some of us are traveling much longer, and those who are traveling much longer are usually people who've quit their job, they're between jobs, and therefore if they cycle 50 kilometers one day and 150 the next, and then don't cycle for 2 or 3 days, then it doesn't really matter. Their pace is kind of dictated by their mood and how long the visa is valid for. And then there are other trips which are much shorter, and so it's like, well, I've only got 10 days, so I really want to maximize, and I'm going to plan this route out, and day one is going to be here, day two is going to be here. And I've done more of the former rather than what I just described. So a lot of my journeys are, well, okay, I know the direction I'm going. And usually, I love wild camping. That's very evident from my travels and my posts. And usually at some point in the day, sort of midday or early afternoon, I would look at a map and satellite and be like, I have a rough idea of where I think I'm going to be able to camp just by what I can see. And so then it's the question of, okay, I have enough food or I don't have enough water. I need to pick up water. And so I'm going to cycle another 40, 50 kilometers and look to camp. Other people, completely different. I know that they would plan a day and be like, right, I'm going 86 kilometers today because, you've booked accommodation somewhere. And of course I do stay in places, and then those days are different because obviously my destination is already set from when I set off. But the days when I'm camping, or there might be some spontaneous invitation, and then, I end up staying somewhere completely different. They're this very much like free flowing, and that is very much the beauty of this kind of slow travel. And I know that most long-term bike travelers would agree with that. It's the unpredictability which people kind of thrive on and enjoy, and I do enjoy the unpredictability of not knowing exactly where I'm going to camp. talking of like phones and apps, so many people these days seem to use apps which tell them, where they can camp, these iOverlander and these other apps. And I have used them, but I feel kind of uncomfortable. I feel like I'm kind of cheating because it's just been made, everything's been made so easy. I have used them a few times when I've been stuck trying to find somewhere, but generally I get a wonderful sense of reward of finding my own place, whether it be by a river or the beach. I feel really smug. And, I'm quite happy to share those occasions, but I prefer it when people show a sort of interest and curiosity rather than me just saying you should camp here, camp here, camp here. I think many people do enjoy finding their own places and planning themselves, but increasingly, I think there's like lots of things in the world. People want things to be somehow compartmentalized and to be able to be just the day is like planned out ahead. Whereas most of my days are not really planned out specifically ahead unless I have booked a hostel or a guest house, and in which case that will be my destination.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, with wild camping there, and do you have like a prerequisite in your mind of what's going to make a great spot for you? You mentioned sort of, finding a river or something, which is obvious because, there's the ability to, wash yourself a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what would your prerequisites be if you're, avoiding iOverlander?
I don't necessarily avoid it, but I wouldn't jump to use it straight away. I have quite a long criteria, and sometimes I think about like giving reviews of my own places. So
That'd be a great Instagram account. daily
just reviewing
daily rating. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Well, I think, often if I'm cycling through a place that has like a lot of natural beauty, whether it's mountains or forests, then I feel that where I'm camping has to be a reflection of that. I would feel hard done by if, I ended up camping in somebody's yard looking out at a brick wall when on the other side of that brick wall there's this amazing valley and mountains and forests. I'd feel like that is not a reward for my day's cycling. So I want to find a place that has all that natural beauty. If it's by a source of water, perfect. Obviously flat, discreet, so that it's not overlooked or seen, fairly easy to access. I don't have to haul my bike a huge distance to get there. But then there are other places I've cycled through where the landscape at the side of the road, when I think back of cycling through sort of semi-urban India or gosh, where else? I mean, I didn't really camp that much in Southeast Asia, but if you're cycling through a place where it's all quite built up and the landscape is not particularly attractive, then I don't really care if I end up camping next to some building site or a quarry or something like that, which I have done. But I really don't. Well, it's not like I don't enjoy it, but places like that are not. Well, they are memorable, but not for the same reasons that the beautiful locations are. And yeah, I mean, certain countries, it's much more easy to find beautiful places to camp than others, whether it's because of low population density or just the way that the country has been managed. You can cycle through countries where a lot of the roadside is fenced. Even parts of, for example, southern Namibia, which has like lots of open land, but it's actually fenced by farmers. And so it actually becomes more of a challenge, whereas other places where it's all very open, it's much easier. Has that answered your question?
Definitely. In fact, something you said there was previous guests. It was actually a discussion, sort of a little mini one on our Facebook group of Seek Travel Ride as well, was guests of the show, Tom and Stevie. They found it quite difficult when they were trying to find wild camping spots in places like the UK and in Ireland. And it was purely because so much of the place is fenced, and trying to, it's not to say that they didn't, but they had the biggest struggles there. And it was another guest of the show had sort of said they cut their teeth learning to wild camp in the UK. And so because of that, now they find it so easy everywhere else they go.
Yeah, well, every country is different. And then there's the whole legality, and it's always a topical issue in the UK. Of course, in Scotland, you have the right to roam, but in England and Wales, you don't. But I don't really have a problem with wild camping here or anywhere in Europe. I mean, I think it's just a bit of, say, common sense. I mean, here in the UK, it's always the context of the country. So you could be following small bridleways or paths, and you look on a map and you can see that, okay, if the land is fenced, I'm not going to lift my bike over a fence, or I'm not going to break entry. But I've camped in many fields where the gate has been left open, and I'm just pitching my tent behind the hedge in the evening, and in the morning I'm gone. I'm not lighting a fire. I'm not causing any disturbance. And I have been found by farmers or dog walkers, and you would just explain, I'm traveling by bike, and here in the UK, I've never really had a problem. It would be very different if you were lighting fires or leaving rubbish, because there are people who don't respect the environment in the same way, and of course, landowners or people living there, they wouldn't take kindly to that. But yeah, there are issues I know in other countries where I've heard of people being fined for wild camping. That hasn't happened to me, and usually I think through experience, when you're traveling, you generally have an intuition about a place as to whether it's a good place to sleep overnight. So if I'm cycling somewhere and I'm following a track off a road and I come to a sort of clearing, and there's a lot of rubbish, and I can see that people drive down this track and they come here maybe to party. I'm not going to camp there because I'm thinking somebody might come in the night. Places where I feel the most secure is when I've left the road and I'm on some kind of track, and I'm like, actually, no vehicle could come down here. I've had to lift my bike over a couple of tree roots, or something like that. Nobody's going to come. If somebody does come, they're probably just like walking a dog or something like that. They're probably actually more fearful of seeing you because people could be surprised that you're just sort of camping out in the countryside. So I don't fear camping perhaps as much as I did before, or it depends where I am. If I don't feel safe, I mean, I remember trying to wild camp in Ethiopia and kind of giving up because it's very densely populated, and I would ask people. It's another conversation really, but some people, when they while camping, they often ask permission, and a lot of the time, depending on where I am, there's no one around to ask. But if it's somewhere where I don't feel very secure, then I would ask permission, and I might end up sleeping in somebody's back garden or backyard. That doesn't happen very often, actually. In Ireland, yeah, I could ask farmers, I could ask in the back of a pub, but I mean, I cycled around Ireland last year, and I camped in some beautiful locations, mostly along the coast, because it has such a spectacular coastline.
It really does. And I always think it's a coastline that when you see it in pictures, if you didn't tell someone it was Ireland, you'd see the pictures of that coast, the white sand and beautiful water, and you'd think it'd be nice and warm. But it's a bit of a shock when you get in there.
Strong winds.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just strong winds, unpredictable weather. So I couldn't always camp in places I wanted to, but spectacular coastline, beautiful scenery, and yeah, very friendly people as well. So yeah, every country is a little bit different when it comes to wild camping, but the sort of same criteria in my head when I'm cycling along is always the same, really. I'm not going to camp near any large town or city, or it's so much easier now. I mean, before I had a phone, with the maps, and I just had paper maps, I had no idea. But now you can look on Google Satellite, and if you see that there's no buildings, and there is some track, and there's possibly a forest or a lake or a river, then it just becomes a much easier decision to go and have a look. So yeah, it's not the same challenge that it was, but I still approach it in the same kind of way, as in not knowing exactly where I'm going to camp that night. But yeah, going back to the iOverlander, a few times I've used it because I've looked at the app, and then I've thought, well, okay, actually, yeah, this is probably going to be the best place that I can pitch my tent. So it is helpful, and I'm happy to share the places that I do camp. But I don't like to over promote it, because I often think that if everybody just ends up coming to the same place, then it just
ruins
changes
the point.
it.
Yeah, it changes the vibe, as I would say as well. Something you talked about and you touched on there, Peter, was you were talking about security and safety. And it's interesting because I guess it's a bias in me in that I perceive as a female, it's often a question I have for perhaps solo female travellers because people perceive that it's too dangerous to travel alone as a woman. But what's it like to travel solo in this manner as a man? You're vulnerable to the weather, to the elements. You've got all your possessions are just what's on you there. You don't have, a security system that protects you and ring fences you in the evening. But what's it like for you to travel in this way? And I'm not saying to tell me, oh no, it's safe, everybody do it. I just mean like practically, like, are there times where because you're alone as a man, like, is it not as safe for you? Do people treat you a lot differently that way? I've had guests who certainly, and sorry for going on here, but I've certainly had guests where, for example, for the virtue of the fact they are a woman, people look out for them a lot more because of that perception of danger for you. But what's it like to be as a man?
Well, there's different things there. I mean, I think I'm a bit older than I was in my first trips, and I sometimes think that if I was a sort of 19 or 20-year-old guy cycling or in my early 20s, people would view me differently as a guy in his 40s, because I think generally this perhaps concept of a guy, an older guy by himself, maybe it's perhaps my own hang up, but I think that if you're a woman or you're in a couple, then in certain countries you're much more approachable because you're not really seen as, not necessarily a threat, but it's just easier for people to approach you. Whereas a single guy who's a bit older, I think sometimes, depends on the country, but I sometimes think people give you perhaps more space. I mean, in recent years, I've been cycling around Europe, and it's very, very different to being in parts of Asia or Africa where everybody just gives you attention. But in a lot of Europe, people just sort of mind their own business. In terms of like security, I generally feel, yeah, quite safe. I mean, I do reflect and think. I mean, particularly sort of perhaps in Islamic countries, I'm cycling through, and I don't really see many women. Even in recent months, cycling through Turkey, particularly in eastern and central Turkey, you don't see many women. So then, when I'm in towns or staying in places, and in the evening, if I go out to eat something, I do reflect and think, well, how would this be as a single woman? It's definitely much easier for a guy. You see, like if somebody on the roadside invites me in for tea or to their house, then, well, if I was a woman and I was being invited by a guy, I'd want to know that this man's wife or sister or someone else was there. Whereas for me, as a single guy, well, I don't have that same sort of set of questions going on in my head. I know it'd be very different for a woman. And I get asked by women, is it safe for a woman to travel solo? And most of the time I say, I think it's fine, but it's much easier if you ask another woman, because you've interviewed many, as to how they cope with it. So no, I don't think I have to deal with that same set of issues, because sadly that's how the many parts of the world are, really.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think overwhelmingly, speaking to the guests that I've been so fortunate to speak to on this show and my solo female travellers there as well, overwhelmingly the message is it's safe, and they wish that more women knew that it was safe because then more women would do this. But it would be remiss of me to say that it's been safe all the time to everyone. I know certainly I have had, I think, 3 of my guests that I have featured who have had some very unfortunate encounters during their trips as well. And I've had a couple of listeners reach out to me on the show as well who unfortunately did not have safe experiences without wanting to go into their particular stories. I don't know that it's necessary. I don't know what makes that any better. I think overwhelmingly sometimes, and I think it's actually one of my very first guests on the show, Dr. Florence Cattell, she phrased it the best for me, was that sometimes bad things happen and it's bad luck. And you cannot avoid bad luck. Being hit by a car is bad luck. And you cannot plan of whether something like that would happen. And you shouldn't live your life in fear of bad luck happening to you and stopping you doing what you want to do, because bad luck can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time, doing anything. And I thought that's probably been the best advice for me personally to take forward as someone, if I wanted to venture as a solo female, of it's not to dismiss things, and you can do things to help make things feel more secure for you, And it's certainly not to say that when you wild camp on your own in the tent that you're not scared, because I don't know that necessarily would go away. But I think that was the best advice I was given on it.
Yeah, I think all travelers, the more they travel, the better judge of character they become, or they ought to. I mean, sometimes I feel like, I've traveled so much, so I feel like I'm a reasonably good judge of character, but often you have to make decisions quite quickly in situations, whether it's on the roadside or an invitation. So you kind of go with your sort of instinct. And I try to look at situations in a positive way, because I feel that if I was always looking at them in a sort of negative and cynical way, then I wouldn't open myself up to new experiences. So yeah, I enjoy all of that interaction. But I'm actually, in terms of sort of character that I am, I'm quite an introvert, so I don't sort of go out looking for this kind of cultural experience. I wait sometimes for it to come to me, and this definitely rolls over into the camping experience. You see, I just like being self-sufficient, and if I meet somebody, this is the thing: if I meet somebody and it's like an organic kind of invitation, and what I mean by that is I didn't instigate it. It feels much more like a natural occurrence. And what I'm saying in that sense is there are lots of places in the world where you can appear or appeal to people by showing a side of you that might come across as like needy or vulnerable. And people, through their own kindness, will obviously then extend and make an invitation. And that could be something as simple as stopping and knocking on someone's door and asking for water and saying, is there a safe place to camp around here? And that person will be like, oh, you can't camp. The weather's too cold. You must come and sleep inside. And then that opens this entire new experience of like, oh, I got invited to stay with these people. For me, like, that doesn't happen as much these days because I'm so aware of everything I need in terms of carrying food or water that I don't really get caught out in the same way that it might happen. I can think of times where it has happened recently, but I don't immerse myself in people's lives perhaps in the same way that other people might do by asking for things. And the reason I'm saying that is because that ends up creating a lot more sort of interaction, and then you might find yourself in a situation which you didn't actually want to be in the beginning, and having to make excuses or say things to not get away, but
Extract yourself from the situation, whatever reason, really, isn't it?
exactly, yeah.
Because it's interesting, you have the benefit, Peter, of being able to reflect back on perhaps how you were when you first set out to how all this accumulated experience has potentially just tweaked how you tour each time. Like, for example, the kit that you take on your trip, you'd have the essentials all the time, but perhaps the details of how you pack them or what you're using to pack them and stuff, it would change. I imagine that would happen, but also you have the benefit now on just seeing how you've changed and how you tour, and you're not to some degree, you know what to expect and what you need to prepare for, so you're
Yeah,
not caught out, and so that changes those interactions for you.
I mean, it's a generalization, but sometimes I can predict how the day is going to go based on how I kind of create it, really. So I'm going to wake up and get on the road, and I'm going to cycle, and I'm going to come to a small village or a town, and I might be hungry. There might be a shop, there might be a cafe. I'm going to buy some food. I'm going to fill it with water, and then I'm going to cycle again, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take pictures, and I'm going to look on my map and see, okay, this looks like a good place to camp. Okay, have I got enough food? Yes. Have I got enough water? No. I'm going to cycle to the next place, get water, fill up. It's a wonderful feeling, actually, describing this, to be cycling along an hour or two before dark with all the water you need and food in your bags, and an awareness that you're going to be able to probably camp in a really beautiful place because the landscape all around you is beautiful. It's an awful feeling. When on the opposite side is when you're cycling along, it's starting to get dark. You don't have any water, or you've only got like a few hundred milliliters, and you don't know when you're going to get water. And you probably have enough food or something, some snacks, but you don't have enough water. For me, water is always a critical thing. So it's like, well, there are all these beautiful places to camp, but I can't stop and camp here because I don't have enough water. So I'm going to have to keep cycling until I find water. So, I do get caught out like that. I usually plan ahead, but there are times where I feel, I wish I could, I can't stop and camp because I don't have enough water. Most of the time, I would eventually find a water source because I would have known that there's a village or a town coming up. How did I get onto that topic? I can't remember.
That's all right. It's just how much you've changed each consecutive trip.
About how much I've changed. Yeah. So predicting the day, but it can be very different. You see, because in certain countries you definitely can't because you're cycling along and then somebody wants to stop and have a chat, and whoever they are, they want to show you the farm that they work on, and the next thing 20 minutes later you're sitting down, eating oranges in somebody's orchard and having tea. That's the beauty and the unpredictability of bike travel that you wouldn't experience, obviously, if you're traveling perhaps in a car or a bus. That still happens in certain places, but it depends where it is. And in most of Europe and I say in other westernized places, that generally doesn't. You're much more left to your own peace, really. But if you choose to ride a bicycle in Iran or India or Pakistan, then for sure your day is going to be very unpredictable.
Yeah, I guess you've got to be comfortable with that sense of uncertainty at times too. A theme that you've come up across a few times is the importance of time, and time is a luxury, but time is also, it's a beautiful part of why you travel in this way, and why you don't overplan is because you do have time to observe, to travel, to change your plans. You mentioned that a few times. Was that something that was apparent to you very early on in the long distance cycle travel space, or even before it was from a cycling perspective?
I think so, yeah. I think I've always felt or said that, once you have time, then everything else will just fit together, because whether it's waiting for a boat which has no timetable to leave, or whether it's waiting for a visa or waiting for something to arrive, that flexibility of time takes a lot of stress off things. But at the same time, you maybe if you have too much time, you can lose momentum. I mean, sometimes I look at my journeys in reflection and think, well, I've had all that time. What just kept me going? Why didn't I just stop? Because sometimes people ask me that, like, all these places you've traveled, is it not anywhere you just decided to stop? And I have stopped, but I haven't really stopped for what I would call a significant period of time. It might be a week or 2 weeks, but not months, particularly when I'm in a foreign country. I mean, that's often dictated by things like visas anyway. But I've always kind of kept going. I feel like I'm connected when I'm on the road cycling. I feel like I don't say it's where I belong, but I just feel like this is what I was setting out to do. But I sometimes feel that perhaps I should stop in places. We talked just before this interview about community, and the sort of cycling community only really exists through online connections. There is no community like there is with, say, rock climbers or surfers who spend weeks or months in a place, because bike travelers, or they might get together if they're all in the same city for a day or two, or you might meet people and cycle together, which is great. But a lot of the time, if you're solo cycling, you are solo cycling for a lot of the time, and you're comfortable with that because that's what you set out to do. But you don't actually build any community, which sometimes I definitely miss.
It's funny, if I was to put an analogy to it, it's almost like when COVID hit and office workers were thrust into a forced work from home environment. And whilst there's the convenience of not having to have a daily commute, there's almost a sense of disconnection from that bonding and that social capital, which doesn't happen in that one space all the time. It's totally different on cycle touring on the road there, but I 100% get where you're coming from too. That sense of community and that sense of belonging, I can only imagine with so much time to think about it as well. There was a beautiful post that I came across, actually, Peter, when trawling through your many beautiful photos, and it's like a photo journal, your Instagram page, and we'll shout it out at the end of the show because I think people would love to kill a lot of time looking back through where you've been. But You were talking about cycling through sections of Africa and you'd met people who were cycling as well on the way. And something beautiful that had come up with this was you don't see many people cycling long distances in Africa. So when you do meet them, it's not like you just stop for a minute to chat.
Yeah.
You actually all enjoy taking the time to get to know each other, to maybe ride together.
Yeah.
Maybe you're going in opposite directions, but you'll actually stop for a decent while to actually connect further as well. Do you think that's because bike travellers are all drawn to wanting that sense of community, and so to speak?
I think, yeah, definitely somewhere where you're not meeting or seeing many other cyclists or foreign cyclists, then when you do, pass each other on the road, often you would stop and chat, and that conversation could be anything from 10 minutes to hours to ending up camping together. And that's wonderful. And I love that. I really do. I mean, if I ever see somebody with a bike that's loaded up, I will always go over and chat and ask questions. I'm curious. And if they don't want to talk for whatever reason, then that's fine. But most of the time they do, because, you show enthusiasm or curiosity. But that's not really a community, you see, because it's just transient. It's fleeting. So that I feel, I mean, this is like off the road, when I'm speaking to you now in a small village where my mum lives in the southwest of England, and I'm actually preparing very soon to like take off on another trip. When I come back here, which I've done a few times now in the last few years between journeys, and I'm not working at the moment, I increasingly feel actually disconnected. I don't have any community. Most of the people I know going back from, university or work in different places, their lives have moved on. They're busy with careers, they've got kids. And so sometimes I feel that my life is kind of static in that sense, because I'm still just getting on my bike and riding around the world. And I know some people may be very envious of that, but they will also ask the same questions that I do to myself, which is like, how much longer? What are you gaining from it? What are you escaping? And I don't have that community. It's just to sort of go meet somebody, because people live all over the place now, and I've got friends in different countries, but I don't like have a network of friends who I just meet up with, because most of them are just busy. Well, I assume they're busy with their lives, and I feel my life is very, very different. So I'm in my 40s now, and I meet somebody on the road who's 20 years younger, and I might be twice their age, but I feel more like them than I would do somebody who's in their 40s, and I say bogged down, but their life is basically their job, their family, their kids, paying off their mortgage and all the bills, which is generally how most people are living their lives. So I feel disconnected from mainstream society, and I don't necessarily think that is a negative thing, but it is the reality, and it just makes me a lot more reflective sometimes, both when I'm on the road, but more so when I'm off it. I question about going back and doing these trips, but I do always come back to the same thought that life is short, and I have the opportunity to do it, and I feel very privileged that I can. I'm very aware of all the mess of things going on in different places in the world. So I sometimes feel that, it's very sort of self-fulfilling just getting on my bike and riding. Who else am I actually benefiting other than myself? And, people might say, oh, well, you're sharing all this and, you're inspiring people. And that's lovely. And sometimes I feel like I am, and people say that. But I sometimes think that perhaps there should be something more. But that's definitely going a bit deeper. But that's where my head has been a lot in the last year.
I can only imagine, because there's such a huge sense of self-awareness there in what you're talking about as well. And I wonder, Peter, you say it really hits you when you're not in the act necessarily of doing your tour. It's probably being surrounded by those people who you're so aware that the lifestyle that you've led is so vastly different. There's a commonality perhaps on where you've lived or where you grew up or where you went to school, but everything else is foreign. Like you said, you resonate more with a 19-year-old solo touring than you possibly would someone the same age as you. I don't even know what the answers to those questions would be. I think I'm certain that it's not a feeling that's distinctly only with yourself, if that makes sense. I could believe fully that many long-distance tourers would have that same feeling as well.
Yeah.
And then questioning, why are you going on this trip? What are you doing? And, oh, gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. See, in the beginning, I mean, the thing is, when, talking about meeting most other bike travelers, the majority, not all of them, but most of them, whether they're solo or in a couple, it's their first big trip. You meet a lot of people who've planned this trip for a year or two, and they've set off in their 20s or 30s. And yeah, I do meet people who are older for sure. I've met people traveling in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, but generally most of them are younger, and so they're setting off on this first big trip, usually like with loads of gear. I mean, that's another conversation. People pack so much, and then they start just discarding things that they don't feel that they need, or they carry on sort of accumulating stuff. But it's often this big trip, this concept of the big trip. So whether it's from starting in France and finishing in Singapore, or whether it's from Alaska to Mexico, or whether it's Cairo to Cape Town, it's their big trip, and they'll spend 6 months, a year, 2 years, and you meet them, and they're doing it with all the kind of excitement of challenge and adventure, and then they go back and they've done their big trip, and their life would then move on, and they you know have a normal life of career and family. You do meet some people who've done a big trip and then do another one and another one, but it's much less common, just because generally people have kind of put that adventure lifestyle behind, and then they've kind of moved on. And so I'm often meeting people who are on these like first big journeys, and I'm not. So I've done a lot more. I feel lucky that I've been able to do that. I'm sure there are lots of people who have done a big trip, and then 10 or 20 years later, they're sitting there thinking, well, I wish I'd done another one. I never regretted any of the trips I've done. That's a fact. I know that I look back. I left a very high paid job a few years ago. I lived in Saudi for 5 years, and I quit my job after 5 years because I felt that I wasn't actually gaining anything there. I was gaining lots of money, but you can't take that with you. And I spent the last few years doing these bike trips, but I don't regret any of them, because it feels like a luxury and a privilege to have experienced that form of travel and had made the time to do it. So
it's almost like you're aware that the reward from doing it is better than the not I don't even know how to phrase it for you, Peter, but it's almost like the self-awareness of the loss of community is something that you're aware of and you've sat with, but you also know within yourself that the reward from going on these journeys has been enough for you to keep doing it as well. It's interesting. I've had the benefit of speaking to a lot of guests who've done, as you've said, gone on these big trips. But the one thing that seems to be a constant with them as well is they'll finish the big trip and then it's not being comfortable with putting the old skin back on and going back to the old lifestyle, because I feel big trips they cannot do anything but change you, change your perspective, change how you view the world, how you view others, how you view yourself. And most people wouldn't return back home the same person. And so I think it would be a rare encounter that someone could go on a long bicycle journey and be comfortable with how things go from there, and whether it's the need to take another big trip or whether it's the need to, I better do the societal norm and go back to the job, the 9 to 5, raise the family and all those things as well. Yeah, wow. Philosophical session today.
yeah, sorry for taking you on those tangents.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We mentioned this before I pressed record as well to my listeners. This isn't an episode where I couldn't possibly do an episode where I say, Peter, give me the highlight of this country. What about this trip? What about day 37? What about trip number 4? Because you've gone to so many places, you've pedaled so many thousands of kilometres. I think so the insights and the luxury for me is to be able to understand those insights and share your experiences as well. You mentioned there about being settled in one place, working there in Saudi. You also took some time off to do some post-grad studies.
Yeah, I did it. Did it at the same time I was working. So I was doing that post-grad part-time while I was working full-time. But carry on. Sorry. Yeah.
How did it feel then, not like being in one place? Like, did that was it hard to sit still with that?
It was a very comfortable life. I felt very say settled. I wasn't settled. I'd never really been settled in any of the places that I worked. I lived in Japan and Tanzania and Saudi, and they all just felt like they were just stepping stones to go off on on a bike trip, to be honest with you. And when I lived in Saudi, I decided to do a master's there because at the time, I mean, it was with a university in London and it was in education and international development. And it was on the back of having spent a few years in Tanzania and worked on a development program with English language teaching that I thought, well, this would be a useful qualification as a kind of springboard out of the classroom to stay with education, which is effectively what I've done when I have worked. But the process of doing the masters and the process of being in Saudi for 5 years and not actually doing really any bike travel apart from a few weeks in the holidays, it made me so restless, and the lockdown at the end, which is another reason I stayed longer, it made me so restless that all I wanted to do when I left that job 2 years ago was just to take off on my bike. And so I hadn't actually used professionally that master's at all. And so, yeah, I found it quite difficult at times, yeah, to have that kind of settled life. But then the flip side of it now is 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, I sort of miss not actually working there, but I miss having that kind of settled routine, where, you go to the gym, you go for a run. I kind of miss that. So it works both ways, doesn't it? Because when you're in this kind of routine working, people just start dreaming about, long holidays or quitting job and doing something. And then when you've had all that freedom for a while, and of course, there's a sort of money aspect of things. If you're not working for a long time and you're out of work, then you think about returning to work. But yeah, the masters, yeah, I did it over a few years, and then I just felt restless, and I wanted to use my time to travel again. I don't know. I suppose as I get older, I'm more aware of the fragility of time, and I know of people who wanted to do things and then they can't because of a sickness in themselves or a very close family member. But yeah, so I thought, well, let me do this now rather than what many people would do, which is work until they're 60 and they start thinking about retirement. And I'm not sure that in 20 years' time, I will be able to do these kind of trips, especially like, the way that I do it at the moment.
I don't know. Like I last week I interviewed an amazing gentleman, Robert, and he's 81. He's on what he's deemed the Octo Odyssey. So he's doing a big trip. Actually, Robert, power to you, because you would have just reached the end of your big trip. He went from the North Pole, Alaska, all the way down to Ushuaia, setting a Guinness World Record at the time. Now, he's doing it on an e-bike because that's what he needs to be able to do it, but power to him. And he's done a lot of travel like yourself before as well. So don't discount the ability to do it when you're 60.
No, I don't.
I think it's amazing.
Definitely don't. It's very inspiring. I'm always inspired by people who are older, who are doing adventurous things, whether it's on the bicycle or something else. I think it's more of a reflection that you don't have a control over certain things. So yeah, that's why doing it when you can.
It was another guest, April Drage, and she lost her mother at quite an early age. And in reflection, she sort of said, life isn't guaranteed, life isn't promised, tomorrow is not guaranteed. That's why to do these things as well. It's interesting because I was sort of thinking, again, getting philosophical, but reflecting back on when you're asking yourself your own questions of why? There's also the other side of
Why not?
Who is the justification to? Yeah, exactly. But also, do you need to have a reason other than it makes you energized? Is it justifying it for yourself? Is it justifying it for others? It's interesting questions, really. But this lifestyle, then, if others were thinking of doing something to this effect, not just doing the one big trip, but looking to carve out a way to sustain multiple big trips, would you have sort of certain advice for them in how they would go about doing that?
Well, I think everybody's different. It's very difficult for me to tell somebody how to do that because it depends on lots of factors, doesn't it? I mean, there's always the context of, well, how are you going to fund this? And so if you're setting off without much in the way of savings, then that's going to be a challenge. I know that some people these days are able to do some work on the road and then they stop. That's perhaps easier than it was before. In terms of advice, I mean, I feel like starting with smaller trips, but then I know, like from my own case and other people, that maybe just setting off on a long trip is the best thing to do. I couldn't tell somebody, oh yeah, I know. My advice would be quit your job and take the next year off. Definitely always advise people, because I remember, not so much now, but I remember lots of people used to ask me, how long does it take to cycle from Cairo to Cape Town, and how long does it take to do this? And it's like how long I've met people who cycled Cairo to Cape Town in a couple of months, and then you meet other people who spend years doing it. So I always feel that having more time is definitely a benefit for all sorts of reasons. If you only have a limited amount of time and you're trying to cover a big distance, then you're always going to be on the most direct roads, which are usually the busiest and the least enjoyable to cycle on. So I think advice for people starting out, would be to not necessarily, because a lot of people who do the big trips, and well, yeah, myself at times included, is you see like your destination, and then it could be the other side of a continent or the world, and then you like plot a rough route to it, but then you start realizing that, well, unless you stay on some of the main routes, it's going to take you like many, many years to actually get there. So sometimes just a trip, you could spend 2 months just in quite a small country. And I think what I really have enjoyed, and I always enjoyed it, was taking the time to go onto the smaller tracks. So, say if I'm heading towards a city and it's 200 kilometers away, and the most direct route is on the main road, then I'd always want to have that time where I could find like a secondary road or a dirt track, and it might take 300 or 400 kilometers to get there. But the experience and the scenery that I had along that way was much more enjoyable than the direct route. But the reality is, a lot of people do take the direct route because it's connected with time. Their map is going to tell you, you can get here in 200 kilometers. And sometimes there isn't the choice. Sometimes there is only that main road, but there are certain countries where you could spend, a long time just on very small tracks. I think people feel more of a sense of accomplishment when they can look on a map and they've gone so far across an area, as opposed to like making loads of little wiggles, because that just doesn't look like you've actually gone as far, but you might have experienced a lot more.
Well, I have to say, though, the wiggly road, which often means a steeper road sometimes too, and the non-direct road has the best experiences for
It
you, though.
does.
Oh, well, personally, like I think my version of hell would be a long, straight, flat road, no bends, no curves, no terrain differentiation. It would just do my head in. Again, it's down to time, though, isn't it? How much time, and time can be a luxury. Can I ask then, with your trips, and you've mentioned you're about to set off on a new trip.
Yes.
How do you?
I'm escaping the English weather. Sorry, go on.
Well played. For someone who doesn't plan the details, so when you plan your trips, what sparks the plan, so to speak? Like, do you pick an end destination? Do you think of what is it that I want to experience? Because again, Peter, 145,000 plus kilometers now, 85 plus countries. Yes, there are many countries still left to discover, but my gosh, you've gone to so many. So are you looking to revisit places, or are you always looking to experience things new? I feel like I've piled on 10 questions all
Yeah.
at once, but
No,
I hope
no,
you
no,
get where
no,
I'm coming
no.
from.
Well, I haven't cycled any of the Americas yet, north or south, and that still is actually going all the way back 20 years ago. It was, I suppose, I did a teaching qualification in Spain to teach English, and my plan was to live in Spain for a short time, learn some Spanish, and then go to South America and do a bike trip. That never happened. I went to Japan, but I do still want to cycle the Americas, but imminently. And no, I'm not. I'm flying to Jordan, and I'm going to cycle from Jordan into Western Saudi. And my brother lives in Qatar. So how well, different trips are, yeah, they're different. I mean, so in this particular context, there's probably 3 or 4 reasons as to why I've chosen that. One was based on a very cheap flight to actually get to that part of the world. Secondly was the weather. I wouldn't choose to go to that destination in the summer, but this time of year is great. Third, well, my brother lives in Qatar, and I'm going to spend some time and visit him and his wife and my niece. And yeah, I've cycled in Jordan before, but I'd like to sort of go back and see more of that sort of desert landscapes. So there are different reasons. So yeah, I do like going to new places, but sometimes it's nice actually to go back to places you've been before and explore different roads. I mean, I haven't planned or booked anything, but I would love to go back to East Africa because I can get by speak. I speak sort of passable Swahili because I lived in Tanzania. So going back to Tanzania and traveling in East Africa has a sort of feeling of familiarization, which is nice in some ways. You know, going somewhere completely new is exciting, but it can sometimes be overwhelming at times as well. So it's sometimes nice to go back to places that you've been before.
I can only imagine, but I was also reflecting on just how much traveling the way that you have, how much it changes the way that you perceive the world as well. Like we've talked a lot on this episode already about maps and routes and planning and things like that, and pulling out a map and thinking of a destination. But like when you've traveled and spent years on the road traveling slowly, does the world feel like a smaller place or a bigger place because of it?
Well, I think it depends. Yeah, I mean, I could say it feels like a smaller place. I could sometimes say that the way that the world has become globalized and this kind of capitalist world we live in, that everybody on their phones and social media, everything feels much more connected. Sometimes places feel similar in terms of sort of commercialization of businesses and chain restaurants and all of that. So that's kind of like a negative way of looking at it. But yeah, I think yes, being on the bicycle, you're always given like a lot more sort of options of routes you can take. So you become aware that yes, the world still has like lots of places that I haven't seen, and there are like lots of new places to explore, even if I've been in that country before. Yeah, I'd never really looked at places as a kind of like tick box, like, well, I've been here before, so I've done it, I've seen it. Like revisiting places and taking new routes, reveals new things, and you're going back at different times when you're older. It's a different time of the year, so yeah, then you realize there's a lot more to see.
Because we've spoken there, Peter, about your desire to do things now because you don't know how long you can do things for, so do them.
Well, I say that as a kind of excuse, really, because there's another part of me, actually, and I say that to myself as, at the moment, I don't know what else I would be doing. And that's kind of scary in a way because, I probably will teach again in another country or online, but I'm not passionate about that. I don't get excited about that. I don't hate it. I don't dislike it. I can enjoy aspects of it, but, it doesn't fill me with like absolute like joy. But aside from that, yeah, if I wasn't riding the bike in places, I'm not quite sure. So then I start asking myself, am I just escaping? And I suppose it's always been an escape, really, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. What am I escaping from? I'm escaping from the reality, which I suppose is many people's lives, which is some kind of 9 to 5 in some kind of form, whether they're rooted to a desk or whether they're working remotely. Because I'm kind of looking like longer term, and I don't have my own place and space. At the moment, I'm speaking from my mum's place in a small village. When I left Saudi, I bought with the savings that I made in Saudi, I bought flats. I bought 2 flats, and they're let out, they're rented, and that gives me some kind of passive income to travel. And I know that people would be thinking, how is that possible? And that's the kind of answer to that. But I never bought those places with the mindset that I would ever actually want to live in one of them. I only really wanted to create this kind of passive income to travel. But as time goes on, I am really seeking and searching my own place and space, and I don't have that. And I never thought I would actually want that like 5, 10, 15 years ago. As time's moved on, it's pretty natural that I do. And so being on the bike isn't actually really helping in that. I'm just escaping. But looking ahead in the years to come, that is something that I really feel like I want to focus on. And I know for some people, they can just be like nomadic and traveling their entire life. But, having your own sense of place and space that's your own that you can come back to and call a base, I think is quite important as you get older.
Yeah, it's that, and as you touched on before, it's also a place where you can start building that community as well.
Exactly.
And who knows what country that might end up becoming for you, Peter? I mean, I guess that's the thing. Like, I wonder, and maybe there's a natural answer to that as well, and whatever that is, and whatever the answer to that is, whether you know it now or not, doesn't really matter. It's sort of inconsequential. But I wonder also with the motivations of you traveling, like, do you think your reasons for traveling now have changed starkly from when you first set off, and even first set off, on those bus tours before the bike travel?
Why not?
Do you think your motivations to go to new places, are they the same motivations as what you had when you first started out?
Yeah, that's good. I don't feel I'm as like wildly excited about starting a new trip. I still get the same enjoyment and fulfillment from the act of riding my bicycle, on new roads or old roads, climbing mountains. I love all of that. The buzz, the exercise, that hasn't changed, and I don't think it ever would. The simple, pure act of riding a bicycle has always felt like wonderful. But in terms of the travel, yeah, I don't know if I have the same. I definitely have the same curiosity about places, but I suppose as I get maybe older, sometimes it's harder not to be sort of cynical, and sometimes look at places in a kind of not pessimistic, but just be more aware of the situation. I mean, I loved my time in Africa and traveling through, and I was aware of the context that my life was so very different to people's lives that I was meeting. But yeah, I've just become much more perhaps reflective of that over time, and ask myself, do I want to keep traveling in the same way that I have done before? But no, I still have the same enjoyment. I still love just having the bike loaded up and then getting on and riding. I think most bike travelers will probably have that same sensation that here we go, we're on another journey. Yeah.
Can I ask a really random question? It's it feels so superficial compared to what we've been talking about, but something, it's not necessarily that I've struggled with, but something that always happens to me whenever I put the panniers on the bike and I'm camping. I always get to my campsite and I can guarantee you it's like, oh, where's this? Which pannier is that in? Where can I find this? Do you have everything dialed down to a T where you go, oh, I need this and it's in the bottom right corner of this? Or do you play which pannier is this in every night as well?
No, oh God, I spent so much time sort of configuring bags and trying different kind of bags. When I started cycling again a few years ago after being in Saudi, I went down this sort of bike packing route of having frame bag and a seat bag, and I thought, well, this is lighter and gives me more flexibility to go off road. But then I've gone back to to using panniers, but I've kind of streamlined it a bit. So there's a bit of a mix between panniers and like fork bags. And yeah, I mean, I would say I'm pretty good at being able to, compartmentalize and know where certain things are. So yeah, basically I have two small panniers on the back. One has my cooking stuff in and space for food. Another pannier is a bit of a miscellaneous. I mean, this is actually new. I mean, this is a new. So you think about having it dialed in. I'm often changing it. I've changed it again. So I have another pannier, small pannier on the back, which is kind of miscellaneous stuff. So it's like electronics with like cables. Has like a waterproof jacket in there, but it's also like actually at the moment half full. So that's like an overflow bag for food. And then I've got two small fork bags, one of which has my sleeping system, which is sleeping bag, sleeping mat, like thermals for camping in. And the other one contains all my clothes. And then I've got my tent strapped onto the rack on the back. So as long as I know which pannier is which and which fork bag is which, then I'm generally okay. Yeah, I have my first trips. Yeah, I carried all sorts of stuff. I mean, I know when you're setting off on a big trip, it can be really difficult to decide what you need and what you don't need. And I know people who might be carrying gear for like many, many, many months and never actually using it. The reality is, most places in the world, well, not specific gear, but if it's a question of like an extra t-shirt or long sleeve shirt, you can kind of pick things up in places as opposed to carrying them. So I try to be quite careful in deciding exactly what I need. But I don't always get it right because there's all these other factors, like you don't know how hot or how cold it's going to be. And so there's a bit of a kind of flexibility. But I do try, if I was to go on this kind of scale of packing from like your ultralight to your like fully loaded, I'd say I was kind of and ultralight was 0 and fully loaded was 100. I'd say I was at around about 30 to 40.
Yeah, so on the lighter side, not ultralight,
Yeah,
certainly not heavily laden.
no,
That has to be the luxury of experience as well, Peter. Like you said, I mean, to some degree, you say you're still changing it and working things out. I think what you're doing is refining it and seeing what changes and what works for you now as well, dependent on how long your trip's going to be. Like, I must say, I keep talking about all your Instagram posts, but it's part of my research. You've just updated your bike. So this trip of yours is new bike,
yeah,
new drivetrain, belt drive,
completely. Yeah, I'm kind of nervous, excited and nervous about that.
low maintenance.
Well, I hope. I've had a roll off, which was an internal gear hub before, but I've never had this sort of pinion gearbox, which by all accounts should be fairly maintenance free. And the belt drive, which doesn't need the same maintenance that a chain would, but that as well as like hydraulic brakes, which I'm not familiar with. So I'm really hoping that, at least to begin with, I don't have any issues. But yeah, I'm very excited and I feel lucky and privileged because that bicycle was basically provided for me by this company that I was in contact with many, many years ago before I went to Africa. And so I put forward a sort of proposal and they kind of agreed to it. And I feel lucky and privileged to have this bike to ride now. Yeah.
In terms of your bike setup there as well, and testament to the way that you do your trips, you're not running, skinny sort of hybrid tires. Like your
No,
bike's set up for off-road adventures, really, isn't it?
this one is, yeah. I mean, I think I like having a bike which has the flex. I love having an everything bike. So it means that it can be ridden anywhere, but it's never actually the perfect bike for any condition, if you know what I mean. So yeah, there's no one bike which is ever perfect for any. Well, there is a bike, but then you can only ride it. If you're going to have specifically like a downhill mountain bike with full suspension, well, that's not going to be very useful if you're riding on city roads. So this bike, yeah, it is very much more spec'd to be ridden off road. It's got quite wide tires, but inevitably, I know I'm riding in Jordan and Saudi, specifically, and I think in Western Saudi, I will be at times quite often on paved roads, even though it's a desert environment. I may be able to find some of these tracks, which for long periods are off road. Yeah, but there will be paved roads, so you just have to deal with that really. But it's certainly more comfortable off road having a bike which has big tires than it is on something with very narrow. That just gives you the flexibility to take it to different places.
I'm just thinking with your equipment change there, and as you said, moving to a pinion system, belt drive, hopefully there's a reality of less maintenance. Someone who's travelled this much, you must have had your fair share of like equipment failures as well, no doubt.
Yeah,
Has there ever been one that like stopped you monumentally?
no. I feel that like bikes and bike maintenance is most of the time you kind of get a warning with a bike. It's very unlikely that a frame is just suddenly going to break. Your rack might suddenly break, but it's very unlikely you're going to get a monumental failure. Having said that, a few years ago, it was quite unusual. I did have a blowout on a tire. The tire was overflated and there was this enormous bang.
Was front or
And
rear?
very fortunate. That was on the rear. Yeah,
Front would be a lot worse.
I know that was completely unexpected, but in hindsight, the tire had been overflated. But other things, not monumental. It was my own, own stupidity a number of years ago trying to remove the sprocket from the roll off. And I was basically turning it the wrong way. So I was tightening it and then I couldn't actually remove it. I was able to continue, but the chain was slipping. But yeah, that was a kind of minor, well, fairly minor thing, really. It didn't stop me from riding. This new bike has carbon forks, which is also I'm a little bit nervous about because I never really associate carbon as a material for for touring. But I think in recent years, technology has moved on, and by all accounts, you can have very strong carbon forks and carbon made materials. But yeah, traditionally, I've always thought that steel, you can't really go wrong with it. But we'll see how I get on. Yeah, my bike maintenance is okay. There's still things that I'm not familiar with. I can't build a wheel. If a wheel is well built, then you shouldn't have broken spokes. But if I do encounter broken spokes, then that's not something I can fix easily on the roadside. But the simpler things like just checking over, the condition of the tires and the brakes and so forth. Yeah, bicycles are relatively simple, at least compared to, if you're traveling on a motorbike or in a car.
It is one of those beautiful things about bicycle travel too, is it's an accessible form of travel for a lot of people as well. It's not, we've talked about the privilege to take these trips. Not everybody, unfortunately, is born with the privilege in the right country to be able to make these decisions. But a bicycle as a form of travel, it's probably one of the cheapest forms of travel as well, in terms of, propelling yourself forward, moving there with that freedom that you had as a kid when the stabilizers first came off. It changes in terms of what you're free to do, but it's the same sort of thing, and it becomes accessible.
Yeah.
The equipment, when it boils down to it, is basic stuff on a bike. And as you say, there's often a warning sign when something's not going quite right. I guess it's being tuned into the warnings.
Yeah, a lot of people don't always see these warnings, like the rim is cracking by the spokes, or they've just neglected their chain and cassette and now it's slipping. There are things that people just haven't really thought to look at. And a lot of the time people just don't do anything until something goes wrong. And then when something does go wrong, well, you kind of hope that you're somewhere where you're close to a mechanic who has the parts to fix it. And I think that, yeah, that depends on the individual. It might be a reflection of how they sort of manage things in their life. Are they proactive before something goes wrong, or do they wait for something to go wrong before they do anything? So that's different people, I guess.
I 100% agree with that as well. So this trip that you're taking, it's about to start imminently.
Today.
We have squeezed this in. I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah.
This has been in the planning phases for quite some time, but our calendars have aligned, which is great. But if people want to follow along with this trip of yours that's coming up, Peter, what's the best way for people to follow your journey?
Yeah, so in recent years, I still have a website, but I haven't touched it. I've totally moved in recent years just to updating through my Instagram at Pete Gost, which feeds into my Facebook. I do upload all of the daily routes into Komoot, which is also, Pete Gost. And then I usually make a collection. So the routes are like pieced together. And then if people are curious to see the roads that I took, and you can see where I've camped. Some people might want to use that as a basis for planning their own trip. I mean, in Jordan, I'm planning to follow. I really do this actually. I mean, this is another conversational question, but these days there are lots of routes which are being created by other people. So this website bikepacking.com has many routes, and there are other websites with routes. But the Jordan Trail is predominantly like off-road trail which runs the length of the country. So my plan is actually to predominantly follow that. I may not follow it the whole time because I may branch off. I have a feeling that I may have to branch off to visit a town for shops or something. But usually I don't follow routes specifically. I feel like I want to create my own route, but it's nice to have a basis of a route so you have something as a kind of foundation to follow. But yeah, I will be posting my updates on Komoot there, and Strava. Strava is basically, in terms of navigation, I've gone back and forwards over the years between using bike computers and phones. And at the moment, I just have a backup phone. So I have two phones, and I have an old phone which I have mounted on my bike, which will have Komoot on, and I use that. But it's my watch, which is a GPS watch. So every day that route just gets uploaded into Strava, and then when I find the time, I tend to make some notes and put them there as well as in Komoot. But yeah, so Pete Gost on Instagram and those other channels are the best ways to follow along.
Awesome. And for my listeners, I will definitely have links to all the ways to follow Pete's adventures in the show notes as well. I'm really excited for your trip. I know we've gone deep and meaningful on this session today, Pete, but I'm really looking.
Sorry about that.
No, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it's been refreshing to just go past the vanilla sort of questions and get into like the full experiences and stuff as well. I was wondering curiously, obviously, we were talking about things, logging them all digitally there. Do you go back to basics each night? Do you keep your own journals and stuff like that as well?
No, sadly not. I mean, I used to. I used to keep a handwritten journal my first big trip, from Japan to the UK and also through Africa. But now I sort of look back and think, how did I have the energy to do all of these things? Maybe I don't have as much energy now. So, in the evening when I'm camping, yeah, I'm usually like uploading stuff, and I didn't used to have, I sometimes can be photo editing and then uploading things maybe to Instagram. I do write a few short notes when I upload something to Strava, but it's in no way a reflection of like anything deep. It's very surface level. It's not like my deeper thoughts on the road. Sometimes I have thought, well, I should be writing more of this down, because on another topic, or the same topic but slight tangent, some years ago I started trying to write a book after the Africa trip before I lived in Tanzania. And I found that process actually in many ways harder than the actual bike journey itself. And I kind of shelved that project, but it's always been in my mind as something I'd come back to. But now, or in the future, any book that I did write would be quite different. I think it would be more like a collection of stories or moments from journeys that I've taken. But yeah, I sometimes feel that I ought to write more down, but my phone has just become, an excuse perhaps not to do what I did before.
Well, can I just say, because the reason I asked that was my cunning way to find out whether you were planning on writing a book. And I really hope that you pick that up again. I would love to read your stories, just as you read the stories that inspired you to spark out on these own trips. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that would be interested to learn from your experiences as well, in whichever way that you would write that. You said that the way you would write that now would be so different.
Yeah, it wouldn't be an A to B travelogue because I've done so many different trips. So I think it would more be picking out parts of different trips, whether it's, camping or being caught by the police or military in Tibet, or spending 10 days on a boat in the river in the Congo. I mean, they're just instances of
Wow.
These stories could form chapters as opposed to like just one travelogue of A to B. But I need to kind of stop the cycling for, in hindsight, actually, looking back, being in Saudi would have been the right time to do that rather than doing the Masters. But I chose to do the Masters, and I don't necessarily regret that. But the life that I'm leaving at the moment, with me starting these trips, it's not conducive for me to be like writing in the way I'd want to. So I really need to sort of give myself a bigger chunk of time in a more kind of settled context to start that again. But it's on my mind.
I have to say, when you talk about, being arrested in Tibet and taking those long journeys on the Congo, I'm just thinking, my gosh, where this podcast could have gone. But we've been speaking so long. One day our schedules might need to line up again and we go down a total different track and we dig into these details. I've just enjoyed just listening to just how the way you're responding to the questions, just the way that your honesty and openness about how this travel life has been for you. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners will too. But my goodness, there may need to be a Peter Gostelow Seek Travel Ride sequel.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the time and the platform to share it all. I can't remember the last time that I did actually, because often conversations are much shorter and they get sidetracked to something else. So yeah, I'm very happy that you gave me the platform to do it. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. We will need to wrap things up now. You've got a plane to catch.
It's not quite today, but yeah, it's very soon.
Okay, so I have 3 questions, Peter, and I asked this to wrap the show up, and I ask it of all my guests. They're not very hard questions. I think one of them's possibly a harder question, and it's music related. And it is, if you had to pick a song to be the soundtrack to your tours, what do you think that song would be? And the motivations for this is to add your song to the Seek Travel Ride playlist.
Well, there's so many, and so I'm just looking through my own playlist, and I feel it should be something which, yeah, when it comes on, it's pretty upbeat, and that's "Lust for Life" by Iggy Pop.
Oh, yes! I love it. Very good.
Yeah.
It's funny, Peter, with the next two questions, sometimes people like sitting on the fence, and I'm always happy to push them off. I was nearly, if you were going to say, I can't narrow it down to one, I've got three, I was nearly going to say, someone with almost 150,000 kilometres in the bank, you're allowed three, but no, I'm glad I've got you down to one.
Yeah, I'm very curious to listen to this playlist which has been put together because I'm always looking for new music and new songs. So a playlist which has been chosen by bike travelers would be an interesting one for sure.
Well, it's available now on Spotify. It's there as a public playlist just under Seek Travel Ride. Okay, final two questions. I think these ones are actually easier. You're going to be riding your bike one day and you have a choice. You can ride it forever up a constant climb, or alternatively, you can ride forever into a constant headwind. Which one would you choose?
Well, I have to answer the question simply as opposed to saying it depends on the strength of the wind and the climb. But yeah. I would probably choose the climb, actually, than the constant headwind, because memories of constant headwinds and like really strong constant headwinds are just awful. You're putting out all your energy and you're moving not much faster than cycling. It's usually in a desert. I had this in Libya. I've had this specifically in Libya. Yeah, I mean, that just got stopped. But as for hills, no, because the thing about cycling up a constant hill in reality is the higher you go, the more spectacular the views are.
Exactly.
And there's no reward with a headwind apart from getting to where you're going to. But with a mountain, the reward is on the way up. And I know you said it's a constant hill, but it's going to have views, isn't it? So yeah, definitely.
I'm with you 1,100% there. And you'll be happy to know that just a rough statistic, which I should tally up now, as we reach near the end of season 1 of Seek Travel Ride, over 50 guests so far. I think less than 5% have chosen the headwind. So I'm just putting that out there now.
Yeah, I would have thought that would have been.
Yeah, exactly.
The likely answer. Yeah.
So, final question for you, Peter, on this super long session that we've recorded today. You're again going to be riding your bike on a day, this time just for 4 hours, which is not a lot of time, but you have the choice. You can ride for 4 hours on your own or 4 hours in the company of other people. Which one would you choose?
Yeah, well, again, it totally depends on the company.
I knew you were going to say that, but I'm pushing you off the fence.
Of course, I will. No, I've done most of my cycling solo, so I would say with company, actually. I'll assume that it's good company. And if it is not great company for different reasons, well, 4 hours isn't that long, is it? So yeah, I'd choose the company.
Lovely. I had an inkling that you were going to say that because it does seem to be a trend, especially for people who ride their bikes long distances, is, well, it's only going to be 4 hours, so I could probably tolerate being with people for that long. So it's quite an interesting sort of insight there as well. Peter, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and connecting here on Seek Travel Ride. I am so energised by hearing about the way that you have taken to this life of travel, this curiosity within you to harness that freedom that you felt as a young kid to keep going forward. You're very self-aware. I feel like you ask yourself a lot of the questions. But the questions for you at the moment, the answer is still yes to keep pursuing this travelling lifestyle that you've got. And I'm certainly going to be excited to see where this adventure takes you and your future journeys. Thank you so much for sharing your story with Seek Travel Ride.
Thank you for having me on. I really look forward to, well, I'm not sure I look forward to listening to it, but I do look forward to hearing and following the podcast because I wasn't aware of it until a few months ago. So aside from the playlist of music, I think I'm going to listen back to some of these interviews while I'm, climbing those mountains or on those desert roads. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to add you to the community. I will say one of the greatest things about starting this show, which was totally unexpected for me, was, I guess, the sense of community that's grown within it. And an unknown to me is it's gone global, but the people that are listening in, they're tuning in, and I get to see where people tune in from. And I can tell that people are tuning in on some sort of far-flung adventure. And then I get people contacting me saying, I'm listening to you while I'm doing this adventure. And then I get to feature those people as guests. So it's a beautiful community, and I'm so happy that you're part of it. And yeah, go forward, go well, and may the adventure just bring smiles to you and the experiences many as well. Thank you so, so much, Peter.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed listening to Peter there, having him share his experiences of a life lived on the road and what experiences he must have. I certainly hope that there will be an opportunity to record a sequel to this, Peter Gostelow Seek Travel Ride Part 2, because I feel someone who has cycled almost 145,000 kilometres, they've got a lot of stories still left to tell. And of course, Peter's just about to embark on his next adventure there as well in Jordan, and I wish him well for that too. To you, my listeners, a big heartfelt thanks as well for supporting the show. If you're enjoying these episodes, I do invite you to go through our big back catalogue, especially if you are a new listener to the show. We have got some amazing guest stories there that we have highlighted. People like Peter who have spent years traveling around the world, other people on shorter bikepacking races, ultra races, as well as world record holders. If you are looking for your bicycle adventure inspiration, look no further than Seek Travel Ride. Have a look in your podcast player, scroll through that back catalogue, and I'm sure you'll be able to draw quite a lot of inspiration there from our increasing guest list. If you want to join the Seek Travel Ride community, make sure to find us there. We are on Facebook. The group name is Seek Travel Ride. Find us there on Facebook. Get in touch. Get involved in the community. In that community, you'll find not just myself and other fans of the show, but also previous guests as well. So I look forward to you joining along there too. Until the next episode, my name's Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.